Origin boots are by far the most requested boot that we've ever had on the channel. We, no joke, get like 2 or 3 requests per day. And I think a big part of the reason is they're the boots that Joe Rogan wears. He's talked about them on his podcast. And Jocko Willink also wears these boots. So we're gonna cut them in half, test the materials, and really see if these are a decent boot made in the United States or if it's just a little bit of hype and shine from the Joe Rogan experience. And if you're wondering if we're talking about Joe Rogan so that we can put it in the title and the thumbnail, you'd be correct. But also he does play a part in this. So we'll go over that in the history, and thanks to Origin for sponsoring this video. So what is it about the Origin boots that have caught the eye of people like Joe Rogan and Jocko? Well, firstly, Joe Rogan is friends with Jocko, a former Navy SEAL and part owner of Origin USA or Origin Maine. But the thing that seems to really resonate with these guys, like Jocko and Joe, is that Origin made the name for themselves by making products in the United States with the goal of truly bringing back the manufacturing prowess to the United States. But not this typical thing where it's made in the United States, where they import tons of parts and even like uppers and different components from all across the world, and then assemble them in the United States. Origin has the goal of sourcing everything from the United States, making it in the United States, and everything that can be done and sourced from the US is done with this boot. That's the goal. But it wasn't the boots that caught their eye, it was the gis, because Joe Rogan, Jocko, and Pete are all Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu black belts. And the gis are really what started Origin. So to give you a quick history from how we started at gis all the way up to making the most American-made boots, it all started in 2011 when the company was founded by the mastermind kind of behind the scenes of all this is Pete Roberts. He started importing Origin-designed Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu gis. And then quickly in 2012, the decision was made to build products on an American supply chain without any compromises, but there was one big problem, and I'll just let Jocko describe this because he describes it a lot better and with a lot more enthusiasm and a whole lot more muscle than me.
They can't be made here. And guess what?
This is specific to gi?
Specific.
Can't be made
They can't be made here. And it was actually pretty true. We said, no, actually they can't be made here and we're making them here. My buddy Pete, there was one loom. You know what a loom is?
Yeah.
It's this big thing that's got like 8 billion parts to it. He wanted to get a loom because he realized that the only way you could get material for a gi was to weave it yourself. Otherwise, you had to buy it from China or Pakistan. So he goes up to Lewiston, Maine. There's a 500,000 square foot abandoned factory. It has one loom in it. Rusty, hasn't been used in 30 years. Him and his buddies, they went and dragged this thing out of this factory. They brought it into this little factory that he had built himself out in the middle of the woods and started taking apart this loom and reassembling it and started weaving material and making gis.
So by 2014, they had that loom fired up, and the first textile they made was the American Pearl Weave. And then by 2017, they moved to a 20,000 square foot factory and expanded operations. By 2018, they expanded from gis to start developing denim jeans. By January of 2019, development began on the footwear. By October 2019, production begins on the leather boots to make boots with as many US materials and components as possible. But by March 2020, production came to a screeching halt because the team switched to making masks because of the pandemic. And then unfortunately in May 2020, the Tasman Tannery in Heartland shut down. They shut their doors completely and stopped production. And this was a fairly large tannery in the United States, one of the only probably under 10 tanneries, and they completely shut down. It was a tannery I used to buy leather from, and a lot of their other companies did, and that's where Origin bought all their leather from. And that's an important part of the story. These cornerstone manufacturing of raw materials are slowly shutting down in the US. But Origin started working with Seidel, which is another really great tannery in the United States, who makes the majority of our leather for our products. By July 2020, boot production resumes. And then by 2021, it's the first full uninterrupted year of producing footwear. Also in 2020, the company purchases 2 apparel facilities in North Carolina to expand their capacity. By November 2021, they launched a composite safety toe version of these boots. And then fast forward to this month that I'm recording this, September 2022, they just purchased a bunch of assets to begin looking at making Goodyear welted products and expanding their facility and capabilities. So a fairly short history for Origin, but a very intense and very motivated and very meaningful purpose behind the brand of Origin. But that really cool story and the history only means so much if the product's not a good product. And so that's really what we're trying to determine with this video. So let's start analyzing the materials, starting with the leather first. So this leather is a waxed leather with a lot of pull up. You know, I've got both versions here. I've got the bison boot that's a little bit more expensive, but the main one we're focusing on is this one. It's a nice waxy leather it's a self-conditioning leather. Is it made in the United States? Yes, this one is. It's made by the Seidel Tanning Company in Milwaukee, and it's their Old Town Folklore leather. And it's a pretty thick leather. It's 2.5 to 2.8 millimeters thick. That's compared to the Wolverine at 2 millimeter, the Thursday at 2.5 millimeter. So far, it's the thickest leather we've seen in the MITUSA series, made in the United States of America series. But we haven't graded the leather yet, so we put the macro lens on it to see what the cross-section looked like. And as you can see, it's got plenty of that grain pattern in it that gives leather its smooth texture on the outside, that also gives it its strength, similar to like the backside of carpet. If you see that glue on the backside that holds all the loose fibers together, same thing with the grain. And we also burned the leather, and you can see it's very similar to that Chrome XL, where it has so much wax and so much conditioner in it. It's really burn resistant, and you almost have to boil off all the conditioner in the leather before the leather actually starts burning. And we also put the macro lens on the top surface of the leather, and you can see that this is not a full grain leather. It's been lightly sanded and buffed, so it has a little bit of that nap of a nubuck leather, but because it's waxed, it almost looks like a full grain leather. So it's not necessarily an inferior leather, it's just a certain type of leather that sand that imperfection of the bug bites, the barbed wire scars off to give you a nice clean leather without compromising too much of that grain pattern. And then they throw that wax coating on top, which lays all those little teeny fibers flat to give it that nice matte finish. So if I were to grade this leather, I would say it's pretty clearly an A grade leather because it has the grain, it doesn't have a fake print, and it doesn't have that plastic coating on top that we've seen in cheap leathers where it just eventually flakes off and completely compromises the leather. And just for fun more than anything, we did the rattlesnake test. We did the puncture test on the upper, and it took 58.5 pounds to puncture through, so slightly more than the Wolverines at 47.5, but not quite as good as the Thursdays at 98 pounds. And then if we look at the leather on the inside of the boot, you can see that there's a suede counter cover, and there's also, you can feel there's a suede lining in just the vamp. But is the lining made in the United States? Well, this lining is also tanned by Seidel, so this is also made in Milwaukee, which is in the United States. So made in the United States. Next to the midsole of this boot, and the midsole is the layer that is kind of the platform that allows you to combine the outsole and the upper together. It's what you sew the upper to and what you glue the outsole to. And this midsole is clearly a big fat slab of vegetable tan leather, and it's preferred over these synthetic and like plasticky midsoles because of that fiber structure on the inside of leather. You can flex it over and over again, and those fibers hold it strong. Versus a piece of plastic, if you've ever bent a piece of plastic over and over, eventually it fractures and breaks. Good that it is a leather midsole, but there's one problem with this. It's not sourced in the United States. This is the only component that I've seen so far before we cut it in half that isn't sourced in the US. This midsole comes from South America, which you'd be shocked at how many boots, I would say 99% of boots that are made in the US, that claim they're made in the US, they get their leather midsoles and shanks and insoles, they get them all from South America. I don't think there's a single company that's making a boot that has a midsole from the US. And then if we move to the insole of the boot, so it's a removable insole, pretty decent insole. It's not like a cheap one or anything, just fabric topped, but it's removable, which is nice if you want to switch things up or you got orthotics. And then underneath of the insole, you've got a pour-on layer right underneath of there. And then underneath the pour-on is a layer of Texon fiberboard. And this was the one component where I was like, there's no way this is from the United States, the foam and the fiberboard. But I talked to Origin, I was like, all right, is that made from the US? They said the fiberboard and the pour-on are both sourced from Ohio. And then you'll notice that on the inside there's a stitch line that goes around the heel. And that's that structural stitch I was talking about that holds the upper to the midsole that the outsole is later glued onto. That's a perfect segue into the construction of this, because this is a unique construction that I haven't really seen in any other boot. You know, it's very similar to the Pacific Northwest construction with the stitch down and the nailed heel, but instead it combines a few different techniques. So starting at the toe first, you can clearly see that this is a stitch down boot because that upper, instead of being tucked in and have a welt sewn to it like a Goodyear welted boot, it's flanged out or flared out and then stitched down to the midsole. And that's how the majority of the Pacific Northwest boot makers do it. It's an affordable way to make a boot, but a really sturdy way to make a boot, and it makes them really easy to resole. And then from there, you can see that the upper is no longer flared out. it tucks in. And then usually in Pacific Northwest boots, what they'll do is drive tons of nails through all these layers, but it takes over 80 nails per boot to do that kind of construction, to hold it that tightly. And that takes a lot of labor, it takes a lot of material, it adds a lot of weight to the boot. But what Origin has done to do a similar construction, but an easier and more affordable way, is where that upper is tucked underneath all the way around the heel. That stitch line that I showed you on the inside sews all the way through that insole, through the upper that's tucked underneath, all the way through that midsole, sewing all those layers together. And so it's a very similar construction to the Pacific Northwest boots. Is it as sturdy? Probably not as sturdy as 80 nails, but I still think it's a pretty sturdy construction, but maybe not quite as sturdy as a Goodyear welted boot like we saw in the Thursdays and the Wolverine 1,000-mile boots. And then if we move to basically the final component of this boot, the outsole, this is the first time I've ever actually had a pair of boots with this particular outsole on it. It's a Vibram little mini lug unit that's really short and shallow. And I really like this outsole because you get a little bit of that traction, you get that Vibram name, but it's really slim and really flexible. Is this outsole made in the United States? Yes, this one is made in Massachusetts, because Vibram has US made outsoles and they also have foreign made outsoles. And so Origin makes sure that they only buy the Massachusetts made outsoles from Vibram. One interesting thing is they've put screws in the toe of the boot, because a lot of times when you're fusing or gluing rubber to leather, they shrink at different rates and they flex at different rates. And so a lot of times they'll either sew all the way through that, or they'll put screws in the toe to make sure that it's extra redundant so they don't delaminate. And as for the hardness of this outsole, we put it on the durometer tester and it came in at a 75 to 78 Shore A. So that's right up there with the rest of the Vibram work soles. And we also did the outsole puncture test just to see how many pounds it takes to pierce through this outsole and the midsole and the insole and everything else in between. The Origin took 249 pounds to puncture through versus the Wolverines was 205 and the Thursdays were 189.5. So far the hardest to puncture through. These feel unique on your foot. They don't feel quite as clunky and inflexible as a regular boot. They kind of feel like a sneaker boot hybrid. And I think a lot of that is because of this stitch down and Blake Rapid stitch construction with minimal layers, a simple outsole and a simple midsole, that low drop in the heel. They keep it pretty light. The paneling of this boot I think allows it to be more athletic feeling, where you don't have that heavy double or triple layered leather across this area. It's got this big cutout, and with all the foam on the inside, it just feels really soft underfoot. And maybe it's just from the preparation for this video, but it really does seem and feel like this would be a boot if a bunch of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu guys made a boot, because it combines the durability, the heritage made goods, but the ease of wear and the flexibility and the comfort, and more importantly, it has a lot more of an athletic feel when you're wearing it compared to the rest of the heritage boots that I own. So that's everything we can know before we cut it in half. So let's get it cut in half, see if there's anything hiding on the inside, how it's built on the internal components, and what else is or isn't made in the United States in this boot. All right, we got it cut in half, so let's see what's inside. So I was gonna critique the fact that this heel stay and the counter cover on the outside only has a single row of stitching, because usually you'll see 2, if not 3 layers of stitching, kind of like you see on the rest of the boot. But after cutting this in half, you can see that this layer of leather doesn't stop where that heel stay and counter cover begins. It continues all the way through. So you could quite literally remove this layer of leather and it's not going to ruin the structure of the boot in any way. It does cover that celastic counter, but it's not necessarily a structural piece. This boot would be fine without it. So I'm not as concerned about that. Ideally, you'd still have another stitch line in there, even if it's just to make it match the rest of the stitching. And then if we look at the inside of this boot, you can see that we got that pour-on foam there. You got the fiberboard, and then you have a little bit of a foam filling on the inside. And usually with this price range of boots and the heritage boots, you'll see a cork filling, especially with the Goodyear welted boots, because they create that void by making a Goodyear welted boot. So ideally we'd see cork on the inside of there, but it's the way that this boot is built, where the upper's tucked underneath there so much that you're really only filling an inch of space all the way through the inside of the boot. And then you can also see the Celastic toe stiffener. And then there's one thing that I almost missed on this boot. There's no shank in this boot. You know, for a work boot, you usually want a shank unless it's a wedge sole. And this boot gets kind of a half pass for not having a shank, because this is basically a wedge sole outsole anyway, and they also come in a true wedge sole. So I'm not sure if the bigger lug versions have a shank or not. Once again, ideally, you'd at least have like a fiberglass shank in there, just for the simple fact that if you're going to use these for work and you're going to be standing on ladders, it's nice to have that support on the inside so that your boots don't do that and wear out the arch of your foot. But it's a pretty simple boot, and I think that's where you get a lot of that feel underfoot of being a more agile, athletic feeling boot. And so if we were to rank this on the MITUSA scale, the made in the United States of America, we got rid of that O, it kind of ruined the MITUSA. But if we put this on the board, so first we've got the Thursdays at the #1 spot, then we have the Wolverine 1000 Miles just underneath. So if we put the Origin boot up there, this was a pretty tough one because I feel like it was fairly close, but I'm gonna put the Origin boot just underneath the Wolverine 1000 Mile boot, because the MITUSA board isn't necessarily about value, because I think this boot is a significantly better value than the Wolverines based on the components, but the way that we're ranking these is strictly on the construction and the components, not based on the price and the value thereof. And now to the final question, are they worth the money? Are they worth considering? Should I buy these boots? So for over $100 less than the Wolverines and being nearly as well built, I think that's pretty impressive by itself. But the fact that every single aspect of this boot, because here's the other thing I forgot to tell you, the stitching, the thread is sourced from the United States, the eyelets are sourced from the United States. Literally every single component in this boot is sourced from the United States and made in the United States, except for that leather midsole. And that's something that Wolverine can't even get close to claiming. So for $100 less, to be just about as good a quality, I think these boots are well worth the money. And the fact that they're made by a brand who is actually trying to bring back American manufacturing and supporting other American manufacturers is pretty awesome. And I think it's important, because I think most people would agree, regardless of your politics, regardless of which country you're from or you currently are in, it's important to have the ability to manufacture basic goods within the country you live in. It doesn't even matter if it's the United States. And so many brands are chasing higher margins and lower costs that we've slowly lost that American manufacturing prowess little by little. It's kind of that death by 1,000 cuts. Over the last few decades, we've completely lost a lot of our manufacturing power. So I think what the guys at Origin are doing is pretty admirable and important. And even if you completely disagree, you have to admit it's pretty cool to be able to single-handedly revive and preserve parts of these lost arts of manufacturing, one machine at a time, one material at a time, and one product at a time. So let me know what you guys think and what other boots you want to see in the Made in the United States of America series, the MITUSA series, because this one was really fun. I don't think I ever would have fully understood the whole Origin thing without doing this video. So thanks for watching and thanks for supporting these videos. It's what makes it possible, and it's what helps me show you guys what you're spending your hard-earned money on, and not just what you're spending your hard-earned money on, but what the brands you're supporting are doing with your money. So thank you guys. See ya.